Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this webinar hosted by Prosper Squared. I'm Lisa Karen and I'm responsible for community engagement here at Prosper Squared. For those of you who don't know us, Prosper Squared are a business club and rewards programme exclusively for business owners and directors. I'm joined today by Simon and Nikki from Brabners. Brabners are a full-service legal firm and are our legal partner, which means that all Prosper Squared members have access to their free legal helpline and also a free audit of their contract of employment, which is a fantastic perk. And if we've got members on the webinar today, I urge you to take that up if you have got queries. Details can be found in our back office or you can contact us for assistance. So to introduce Nikki and Simon, our speakers, Nikki is a legal director in the employment team at Brabners and Simon is an employment partner and head of recruitment. Both advise on a range of employment related issues, so we're in great hands today and it's a great opportunity to have your questions answered. Or to contact them afterwards if you need any further support. I urge you to take this opportunity to ask questions, so please do so in the chat. You can start whenever you like putting questions on there. I'll try and make sure we answer as many of those at the end as possible. We expect this session to be about 40 minutes. We are going to have some polls for you to be interactive with so that we can sort of get some temperature checks from you. Please select write to all attendees and speakers on the chat so that everybody can see what you're saying. I think that's about it. Without further ado, I will launch the first poll. And please give us your answers before Nikki starts. So our questions today are, where are your staff currently working from? Mainly from home, mainly from the office, or a mixture of both? And do you have a home working policy in your business? Yes or no? So just got the final responses coming through now. Thank you, everybody. I'll share those results. So looks like we've got a mainly office and mix of both. Even split between those guys. And nearly 50-50 on the home working policy. So Nikki, do you want to pick up on those?
Yes, well, thank you very much, everyone, for obviously participating in that poll. What I'll do is I'll address them at sort of the relevant points during the presentation. Actually, we can kind of look at them and discuss them in general in terms of the points that we're going to cover. So just to kind of outline what we're going to talk about today, we've decided to split the session into two. So firstly, I will deal with business continuity. So looking at the situation where employers intend to continue largely unchanged, at least in terms of the structure of the business and obviously the staff employed. So we'll look at the positives and negatives of home working, the challenges with returning to the office for those who haven't yet returned, and obviously the continuing challenges for those that have, and then future-proofing policies to ensure that they are applicable to support the new ways of working that have been introduced as a result of COVID. Simon will then deal with critical, business change. So we're looking at where employers are considering changing in terms and conditions on a temporary or a permanent basis, making redundancies in order to reduce headcount and overheads, restructuring the business to streamline the business, and also he'll consider what alternatives there may be to redundancies. So first of all, home working. So after lockdown was announced on the 23rd of March, the Cabinet published guidance calling on those businesses which were permitted to remain open to take every step to facilitate employees working from home. And you're only permitted to travel to work where home working was not possible. And as a result of that, many employees have been working from home since that date. Now, prior to COVID, the pandemic, many businesses were adopting more agile ways of working, with some employees working from home on an ad hoc basis. Some of them working under current existing arrangements as part of their normal working week. However, the pandemic seems to have accelerated these changes, and as businesses that previously didn't contemplate allowing staff to work from home have quickly had to adapt to the government's guidance at the start of lockdown, which was basically to permit travelling to and from work, but only where this is absolutely necessary and can't be done from home. Obviously, I appreciate the message has changed during the pandemic as restrictions have been eased and obviously to be reimposed. Now, obviously, we posed the question, Lisa kindly raised the poll about where your staff currently are working, and from looking at the statistics, it seems to be actually that the majority is more like a mixture of both, or actually mainly in the office, which is kind of good to see that people are more back in the office, but there are still 18% of you that have staff that are mainly working from home and remotely. And it's an interesting statistic actually, that was data that was from a survey conducted by the Institute for Employment Studies that did show that during the first 12 weeks of lockdown, there was 71% of respondents were working at home due to COVID, which is obviously quite a considerable number of workers working from home. And as I said, the change to home working has been sudden and has been a new experience for many, and it's led to obviously advantages and disadvantages for both employers and employees. And we're going to look at the positives and negative aspects of home working now, as well as obviously the legal obligations that we're under. So I'm going through obviously the slide that we have here. So obviously we don't have to commute to the office anymore, which for some is a major benefit. Obviously saves time, also associated frustration with delayed cancelled trains, getting stuck in traffic, positive flexibility to work around your childcare, caring commitments more easily, obviously seeing more of your children, having a lie-in. Your commute obviously is now a matter of meters to your desk rather than having to trek on a train, or as I used to do, having to trek into Manchester on the train and obviously be stood shoulder to shoulder with many people. Flexibility also around sort of starting earlier, technically finishing earlier, more productive for some. Some employees believe it's they have less distractions working from home, and therefore it's very much more productive in terms of their performance and work output. However, I appreciate that not everyone will have seen those benefits from home working. For some, the commute offered them obviously some time on their own, a transition between home and work, time to detach from the stresses of the job, and to sort of switch off and read a book or obviously listen to music. There's obviously the concerns about the blurring of work boundaries, the ability to log in from your dining room table or your sofa makes it more difficult for some to switch off. Quite a major risk factor with working from home is this lack of social and physical interaction and the feeling of isolation, because many employees work better and like face-to-face interaction, so do struggle with working from home, especially those that live on their own. Well-being, again, with mental health issues, which is a big concern. Then we've got reduced productivity and distractions in some cases, and that is a concern, I think, for some employers that are concerned about the lack of visibility and understanding what their employees are actually doing during the working day, and concerns about work output and performance. Concerns again about maintaining team spirit, and also challenges in terms of how you do manage and supervise your employees when they're working remotely. So if we move on to the next slide. So it's clear, obviously, working from home in a pandemic is different to working from home in non-COVID times. There are obviously added pressures, particularly with mental health, well-being, for employees dealing with the changing in restrictions, the risks to the jobs, concerns about finances and friends, and obviously this has an impact on mental health very much so. So it is very important for employers to try and support their staff and well-being. Obviously, there are very important reasons why we would want to do that. Obviously, morally, it's imperative to look after staff. Financial reasons, healthy staff are obviously more productive and engaged, which leads to better financial turnover, less sickness absence, and increased staff retention. Failure to look after mental health and well-being could obviously lead to poor employee relations and ultimately to employment tribunal claims. So what are the ways that you as employers can support your employees and who are working from home? I think first of all, raising awareness of the impact of of mental health issues and help to reduce the stigma of raising mental health within staff, so staff feel that it is a safe place at work to raise such concerns. Also using anonymous surveys on mental health and wellness to try and see how employees are doing, to identify any trends and put in place any measures to address them. Building online communities and employee networks to try and replicate the community spirit that obviously you had working within the office. Introduce mental health first aiders and or train managers to try and spot any signs of stress or employees suffering with mental health. Line managers regularly checking in with their team members to see that everyone's okay, having that regular contact, which helps. Trying to encourage the use of videos on calls, obviously, and sort of rather than just telephone. If you've got group meetings, trying to get everyone to turn on their cameras, which I know some people are reluctant to do, but obviously just trying to get that face-to-face interaction. Also, staff picking up the phone to speak to people for that personal connection rather than emailing. So rather than sending an email, why don't we pick up the phone to staff to try and have some sort of more contact. So these are all important and quite hopefully straightforward ways in which you can just think about trying to help employees who are kind of working more from home. So now if we look at returning to the workplace, which I appreciate for many of you, you've actually got employees in the workplace already, and obviously just looking at what the guidelines are in terms of working from the workplace. So in September 2020, the government launched an advertising campaign aimed at encouraging employees to end home working and to try and get staff back into the workplace. However, there was a sharp policy change on the 22nd of September in light of the rapidly rising cases. So this reversal of guidance changed to advise that office workers who can work effectively from home should do so over the winter, although anyone who can't work from home should go into their workplace. Now, some staff wish to go into the office for reasons we've discussed, because they struggle to work from home for mental health reasons. They kind of really need that face-to-face interaction. Some others have concerns about, logistically, maybe there's interruptions at home if they've got a spouse or a friend working from home as well, or if they've got concerns about kind of what their equipment is and the resources available to them. Now, in our experience, many employees have wanted to keep going into the office for the reasons discussed, ranging from looking after their own mental health to lack of suitable setup and equipment and resources at home. Now, I think that provided that you've completed a risk assessment and are comfortable that you do have a COVID secure workplace, then if the employee has a good reason for not being able to work effectively from home, then obviously you can still allow them to work in the office. We move on to the next slide. So as you're all aware, on the 12th of October, in response to the rising number of COVID cases in certain areas, there was a three-tier system of restrictions has been announced. Now, this new three-tier regulation focuses on gatherings, rather than travelling to work, which is what the original regulations did. And they do ban outdoor and indoor gatherings to differing degrees. Now, although the 3 alert levels do differ in terms of what kinds of activities can take place, the restrictions on gatherings in each tier are subject to the same exception. So where gathering is reasonably necessary for work purposes. Now, if a work gathering falls within this exception, it is allowed within all 3 tiers, and it's no upper limit in terms of, excuse me, on its size. Sorry. So what is reasonably necessary for work purposes? Now, this question is probably more relevant in terms of an office context than, for example, a shop or a factory, because obviously with a shop or a factory, it's quite clear that it is reasonably necessary for obviously staff to go into work. The question then is posed in terms of an office environment: when is it reasonably necessary for office staff to go into work? Now, I've set out there just some specific office work questions that we can look at. So going into work to actually sit at your desk and physically work arguably doesn't constitute a gathering. Now, there's added complications in terms of meetings. So if obviously there's going to be a meeting within the office, then arguably this would be a gathering. And in order for that to be permitted, you need to pass the reasonable necessity test. I think in doing that, you probably need to consider whether the meeting could be held effectively online. If obviously that is the case, then arguably it isn't reasonably necessary for that meeting to take place on a face-to-face basis. And obviously it should be avoided. If we just move on to the next slide, dealing with obviously COVID compliance and what approach to take in terms of the steps that you obviously should follow in terms of returning to work or maintaining employees working in the office. So workers who can effectively work from home should do so, and employees shouldn't be encouraging or asking employees to come into the office. It should be very much on a personal choice in terms of if employees think it is reasonably necessary and that they need to be there. Anyone else who can't work from home, including for reasons such as poor working environment or insufficient equipment or mental well-being, can still go into the office. Employees should ensure that they have done their risk assessments and made workplace COVID secure, and that they follow the COVID secure guidelines closely. And also ensure that you react to any outbreaks and do so by following the COVID secure guidelines, which set out what employees should do in the event of any outbreak within the office environment. Okay, so now moving on to future proofing, which is quite difficult to get to say future proofing policies. Now, probably important to review your existing policies to ensure that they are applicable to and they do support the new ways of working that have been introduced as a result of COVID. Policies that may be affected include, so first of all, home working policy, which obviously what we asked the question at the beginning of the session. So it's good to see that there are a fair number of you that do actually have a home working policy in place. For those of you that don't, you may want to consider whether or not you need one, particularly as it would appear that home working is something that's going to be here to stay for at least the foreseeable future, given the current climate, just to help draw all the relevant issues together and regularise whatever the existing arrangements that you do have in place in terms of home working. And if you do have a home working policy already, is just to review that policy to make sure that it meets the new circumstances. So, for example, that it covers health and safety matters. So you do have the same health and safety duties that apply when you have home workers, as well as obviously if the staff are working within the office environment. So in just ensuring that working patterns and the levels of work are not detrimental to health, reminding employees that they have an obligation in terms of looking after their own health and safety. So obviously ensuring that they're taking the required breaks of obviously 20 minutes every 6 hours. Dealing with data security and confidentiality, so things such as storing information that's got confidential information. Employees are locking their laptops if they're leaving them unattended, password protecting any documents, ensuring the secure Wi-Fi, reminding employees of any IT and data privacy policies that need to be complied with, thinking about how you'll manage and supervise employees on a more permanent basis if they're working from home, looking at the provision of equipment, who's going to provide the equipment, the use of the equipment if only employees can use laptops rather than letting family members use any equipment, and obviously they've got responsibility to look after that equipment. Looking also about responsibility for associated costs, working from home, such as heating, lighting, Wi-Fi, which we've actually had some clients raise queries about staff that initially were quite happy to work from home. As time has gone by, have now begun to get frustrated about thinking, hang on a second, I'm working from home, you know, but I'm paying my heating bills, my electricity, it's my Wi-Fi that we're using to do work. So it's just to try and iron out those issues. Also looking at the sickness policy, you might want to obviously deal with it, adjusting the notification, the evidence requirements for COVID-related absences. Obviously, that will be instances where employees themselves are having to self-isolate, not because they have COVID or have symptoms, but someone obviously that is in the household does so. Looking at the disciplinary grievance and performance management policies to cover remote working. So, for example, when you're having a grievance hearing or a disciplinary hearing, rather than having it in person, you obviously need to do it remotely via video link up. Health and safety policy. So just reminding staff about the health and safety policy. You might need to review it in terms of home working to cover those situations. Also, as I said, reminding staff they have a duty to look after their own health and safety and to cooperate with you in terms of requirements. And on that point, just to flag that employers that have got 5 or more employees do have an obligation to have a health and safety statement and to make that available to staff. The next one is time off work. So you might have instances where an employee wants to take time off in varying circumstances. So if you haven't got any of these policies, or if you have got them, you might just want to review them. So for example, compassionate leave, you might have an employee who has either a bereavement or a member of their family is critically ill. So you might want to have a look at, you know, obviously offering unpaid or paid leave in these circumstances. Now, there isn't a statutory right to compassionate leave outside of the parental bereavement leave, but it's something that you might want to think about or at least consider in case you are asked the question. Time off for dependent policy, again, employees might need to take time off to look after their dependents, children, parental leave, in terms of whether employees might want to use some of their parental leave in terms of having to look after children as a result of, for example, them being sent home from school to self-isolate. And then finally, flexible working, again, considering circumstances in which you or your employee might want to adopt certain forms of working, of flexible working to obviously address the ongoing situation and any changes that they might need to their working arrangements to deal with those. And that's it for my part. So I will now hand over to Simon to deal with.
Do you want to try launch poll 2, Simon?
Yes, please, Lisa, if that's okay.
We've got some great questions coming in, but we will answer those at the end. So poll 2, guys, 3 questions. Are you planning to reduce your employee numbers in the next 6 months? Have you made any changes to your employment terms? And do you think your business will grow? So we've just got those filtering in now. Would you like me to throw a question at you while we're waiting for the polls to come in?
Why not? Go on.
Okay, we've got a good one here from Steve. He's asked about whether an employee is required to provide laptops for home working. And if not, what are the potential implications from a GDPR perspective?
Do you want to take that, Nikki?
Well swerved, Simon.
Well,
yeah,
you know, there you go. I mean, the reality is that there's no legal requirement either which way that has to be provided. Although clearly, if it's a necessary tool to do the work that's being done, then the employer will need to make sure that the equipment is there. So I'm certainly aware of clients that, well, there was a massive laptop shortage in March, for example. So I did have clients that weren't ready with enough laptops, where people had to lug their sort of desktop computers home with them on the train and various things, and that didn't go down particularly well. So there's no legal requirement necessarily to provide a laptop from an employer's perspective or from an employee's perspective, but clearly if it's a tool that's needed to do the job, then it's in the employer's interest to make sure that it's there. Now, if an employee is using their own laptop, then that very much comes into what Nikki was talking about with regards to policies. So really sort of using your own device, bringing your own device to work, because clearly there are GDPR and confidentiality issues with regards to that. If you've not got an agreement in place and they are using their own laptop, then your ability to sort of control what happens to that data that they're using whilst they're using their own laptop, you haven't really got much control over it, other than to say ultimately that it is our property. So all the IT security that would normally be in place around someone using a works laptop isn't necessarily going to be there. And I suppose it depends how sophisticated you are. So, for example, in our business, I use my own mobile phone, but all the information with regards to work is app based. So work can turn off the apps should I lose my phone or should there be an issue in respect of it. So, no, there's no legal requirement to provide a laptop, but if it's a necessary tool, then it's in the employer's interest to make sure that they've got something to use. And if you are going to allow an employee to use their own laptop and IT equipment, then sort out your policy ultimately to make sure you've got some control and visibility over the information that's being stored and used on it.
That's great. Thanks, Simon. So poll results actually very encouraging then.
Yeah, good.
So quite surprisingly, most people think their business is going to grow and not necessarily looking at reduction of workforce, which is nice to hear.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Yeah, no, and that's really positive, because March, which seems such a long time ago now in so many different ways, did look really bleak. So, as one employment solicitor in a team of 30 employment solicitors, on the sort of Friday, the 20th of March, which is when the Chancellor announced the furlough scheme, I did a quick tot up of all the redundancies that I'd been instructed or been talking to clients about that were due to start in the next few days, depending on what the Chancellor's announcement was going to be around furlough. And I had about 30,000 redundancies sat on my desk at that particular moment in time, which is unheard of. I've old enough to have been through 2 recessions now, and this will be the 3rd. But I'd never had numbers like that at such a sort of a critical point, one point in time, and that was quite scary. It took quite a lot of persuasive powers to get companies just to hold on to see what was going to be announced on the Friday, on the 20th of March, and obviously the Chancellor announced the furlough scheme. And what we found, I would probably say anecdotally, and what we see is probably reflecting on what there is in the poll, because those 30,000 redundancies, that sort of tsunami, if you like, of job loss, certainly hasn't happened in the last sort of 7 months. Now, I'm conscious that obviously we're coming to the end of the job retention scheme at the end of October, and it is very sector specific. We've seen that certainly in Manchester, where we're based, around tier 3 and the nighttime economy and the hospitality industry. So there are sort of sector specific issues in respect of this, but on the whole, those sort of 30,000 redundancies that will just need to press go week commencing 23rd of March haven't happened. However, what we have seen are people taking opportunities to look at the structure and shape of their businesses, and perhaps to be a little bit more strategic about the changes that they're making for critical business reasons, because they need to do that to keep the profit levels where the profit levels need to be and the amount of business is reducing, or alternatively looking at making sure that the business is fit for purpose as we move into the next phase, or the horrible word of new normal, whatever new normal may ultimately mean. So, what are the options around that when you need to make changes, when, how the business was shaped and how it looked on the sort of end at the end of February isn't necessarily what you're going to need to move into the new year, into 2021. And really, there are two aspects to this, and we'll be looking at two ways today. First is looking at changing terms and conditions, and then the second aspect is really around then redundancies and restructures and removing people from the business. And there's some of the issues that we're finding that are very sort of COVID specific that are raising their head in respect of the situations we're seeing. So, we've seen lots of changes to terms and conditions of employment. Some people took very knee-jerk reactions at the start in March, when no one knew what the business was going to look like, what spending patterns, what the recession that clearly was coming down the tracks was going to look like. And some employees took a very sort of knee-jerk reaction and said, okay, right, a 20% pay cut. Everyone agrees to a 20% pay cut for a period of 3 or 4 months until we see how things are happening. That will buy us some time, that will keep cash in the business, and that will allow us to make considered decisions about where we move forward. So quite a lot of temporary changes. And, one of that could be working from home. So clearly, lots of people had never worked from home previously, had always been sort of office based, or, at least workplace based. And all of a sudden there was a change. Everyone was working from home. The reality is that was a variation to people's terms and conditions of employment, because their contracts will have said you're employed to work in Manchester Centre, you're now working in at home in Stockport. So that was a temporary change that took place to the terms and conditions of employment. And what you found with a lot of those temporary changes, and because of the circumstances that they were happening and they were being asked for, people were prepared to accept that and go with it, because we were in a pandemic, we were in this together, no one knew what was coming down the tracks. So it really surprised me, pleasantly, I have to say. But clients were saying to me, this is what we're proposing to do. We're not proposing to go through any consultation, really. We're just going to basically put it out there and ask people to take a 20% pay cut. And I was sort of sat here as an employment solicitor going, oh, okay, well, you're not really following the correct procedures, but if people agree to it, then that's great. And that's what happened in those early stages. People were prepared to sort of stick together and say, yeah, okay, for the greater good of the business, for the ability to keep my job, I'm prepared to agree to these temporary changes. And as we've moved through, as with lots of things with COVID, we've started to see some of those attitudes and willingness start to change. And so what people were asking of their employees in March, when they're asking for these to be renewed now, or to look at other temporary measures to allow them to buy some time, we're not getting quite the same universal buy-in. We're starting to see a little bit of pushback, a little bit of sort of arguments around actually why and how. So we'll look at that from a temporary perspective, then obviously making permanent changes to terms and conditions. So, I do lots of work in the recruitment business, in the recruitment industry, and lots of recruitment businesses, certainly smaller recruitment businesses, have taken the decision that they are no longer going to have a workspace and office, that actually they are going to all work remotely. So again, these permanent changes now to you're becoming a permanent home worker, that's a slightly different approach that will need to be taken. So we're going to have a look at both of those, and just see how they differ ultimately and what's the same. I mean, it's a bit of an obvious point, but it's one that I will always make, is that actually your starting point is to check the contract, because it might already do what you need it to do. So, there are two ways of looking at a contract. You have express terms, so those that are in black and white on the ink on the paper, and you have those terms that are implied into the contract, which are so obvious that they don't need to be committed to ink, if you like. And lots of times you can enter into a contract of employment at the start of an employment relationship, fast forward 5 years, 10 years in some circumstances, and actually if you've never looked at the contract of employment other than when they've signed it on day one, the reality is what's happening day to day may be very different to what the contract envisages is happening in practice. So the first point is to check the contract. Does it allow you to make changes? Does it allow you to do things on a temporary basis? And if it does, then actually you don't need to vary the terms and conditions because it's already there. If the contract says that actually, so for example, use a really obvious one. So what often happens is people's salary might increase each year, but clearly the contract sometimes doesn't get updated each year to reflect the new salary. Just because the contract, in as much as the paper says that you're on £30,000 a year, but the reality is that you're earning £60,000 a year 5 years down the line, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can go back to the contract and say, well, actually, I'm giving you a pay cut. The contract says you're entitled to 30. That's what you're getting. And there's no change to the contract, because obviously it's an implied term of the contract that you're getting paid £60,000 a year now, even though the actual paper might be completely out of date. So first of all, it's assess the situation, do a bit of due diligence, sit down, take a bit of time to work out exactly what does the contract say, what does the contract allow you to do, what do you want to do, and do you think that ultimately the contract already allows you to do that? Because if it does, then you can go forward with a lot more confidence than you perhaps would do otherwise. If the contract doesn't reflect what you want to do or doesn't allow you to make the changes you want to make, then you really need to think about, first of all, getting agreement. So going back to that analogy that I gave you right in March at the beginning of the pandemic, that's what happened. We need to implement a 20% pay cut for a period of 3 months. Do you agree? Yes, I agree. Great. That's a mutual variation. You are varying the contract, but your employee is agreeing to the variation that you are proposing. And that is great, because again, there is no issue with that whatsoever. Make sure it's documented, make sure that there's a clear audit trail, but as long as they agree to the changes that you're proposing, then there is no issue. Same as you would from a legal perspective if you were offering someone a pay rise. Often that's obviously not rejected, that's normally accepted. That's a variation to the contract, that's fine, and that's not a problem. And it's the same if you're making changes. As long as the employee agrees, then you should be home and dry, as long as you record what those changes are and their agreement. The thorny issue, and where you're probably picking the phone up to us, is when there is no agreement. And again, going back to the situation I was talking about, this is what we're starting to see now, whereas people were prepared to go with the flow and agree to lots of things that employers were suggesting in March. What we're starting to see now is that actually that's not quite as universal as it was. So if you've got no agreements, the employee says, no, I'm not prepared to agree to a 20% pay cut, or I'm not prepared to agree to work from home permanently, then you've got to look at how do we go about making those changes and it not ending up in a claim. So first of all, have a look and see if there's anything to rely on with regards to conduct to imply that they've accepted the change. So the working from home is a really good example. You've been working from home for the last 6 months. We're now making a decision to permanently move to work from home. You've already been doing it for 6 months. What is the problem with you continuing to do that? Communicate, and obviously that hopefully will bring out what the specific issues are. And it could be, as Nikki was saying earlier, I don't have the right desk, I need a bigger computer screen, I don't feel that I've got the right space that I can work at home. There's lots of instances where, certainly young professionals and sort of people sort of lower down the earnings ladder were sort of in a situation where they might be in a house share where literally they were getting out of bed, going to the kitchen, making themselves their breakfast and a cup of coffee, coming back to the bed, sitting on the bed, working away for the day, and really didn't see more than 4 walls. And clearly, if someone's saying to them, look, we're making a permanent change and that's going to be life moving forward, clearly that isn't necessarily going to be something that is going to be right for that particular individual. So the fact that they've been doing it for 6 months, you need to understand why they're not prepared to continue to do it, and try and deal with that and address it through negotiation to get to the point where they do agree. If you're at a point where there is just going to be no agreement whatsoever, and there is a very firm decision that this needs to happen, then you need to look at terminating their employment as it exists now, and then ultimately offering them a new contract, a new terms of employment, which reflect how you want it to work moving forward. And to do that in a fair way, you're going to need to have had those conversations, that consultation in respect of these are the changes, these are what we want to do, these are why we want to make them. Understand the sort of pushback from the employees as to why they're not prepared to agree it, try and deal with those issues, and do all of that before you come to the conclusion of, right, okay, we need to bring this employment to an end and we need to start a new employment. You terminate, you give them the notice they're entitled to in the contract, you bring that contract to an end, you offer them the new terms, and it's up to them then as to whether they want to accept or reject those new terms. If they accept the new terms, then great. It's taken a bit more time, a bit more effort, but we've got there in the end. If they reject those terms, then clearly they've left your employment. Can they bring a claim? It depends on how long they've worked for you, and it depends on how good your procedure is, your consultation and your discussions up to that point. Hopefully, if you've got it right and you've done it correctly, and it's important to probably take advice in respect of that. If you get pushback from employees, then the answer should be no, they shouldn't be able to bring a claim. But that is very fact sensitive and circumstantial. So, you know, the whole point of this is do it properly and to protect yourself, because if you need to make those changes for business critical reasons, you need to make those changes. And it's important that you don't end up with a claim as a result of having to make those changes, and you shouldn't have to. Okay, and then, you know, moving on to redundancy. So, you know, we need to reshape the workforce slightly, and we can do that through changing terms and conditions of employment. Actually, we're looking at the amount of work coming through the door, and we don't need the same team of people that we had previously, either because the work's changed and the nature of the people that we need has changed, or because purely we've got less work coming in, therefore we've got a need for less people, and that's redundancy. So, you know, redundancy is defined in the Employment Rights Act ultimately as either the employer ceasing to exist, so the employee going into liquidation, going bump, the place of employment ceasing to exist, so the office goes up in flames, or the employer's need for employees with particular skills or experience has ceased or diminished. And that's normally the one that we'd be going for here, is that actually the world has changed and actually we don't need people with your particular skills and experience, or as many people with your skills and experience to do the work that we've got coming through the door. So that would be a genuine redundancy situation. I would say what we're finding at the moment is that that is sometimes forgotten, and people are just riding sort of roughshod or on the tailwinds of a pandemic. You know, there is an economic recession, there is you know, the businesses, there's an uncertainty, there's a lack of confidence, therefore we need to make redundancies. But there's a lack of then linking that sort of business situation to the individual that you're then looking at making redundant. And really you're looking at making the role redundant. That's the first way you would approach it, is say, actually, we don't need that role any longer. And what we are finding is quite a lot of sort of middle managers, that sort of, you know, layer of management is being removed, where perhaps they're not being generating sort of fees, costs, revenue, and that they're looking at honing down the number of management skills to reduce the cost base. So, you know, redundancy is relatively straightforward. Once you've got a genuine redundancy reason, it's a matter then of informing the employee, starting a consultation process with that employee, looking at alternatives that can avoid redundancy, giving them an opportunity to understand why your decision making and how you've come to the point of making a redundancy and selecting them for redundancy, and then confirming the decision. If you're talking big numbers, so if you're talking over 20, then there are collective consultation requirements that kick in. That's a talk in itself, which we're not going to cover today, but this, what we're talking about here, is the sort of odd 1 or 2 and certainly less than 20 redundancies that you're proposing to make in a relatively sort of short period. I would also say one of the main areas where businesses fall down when they're thinking about redundancies is the selection process and pooling. So ultimately, properly thinking about, actually, you know, is it a layer of management that we need to take out? Should we be putting everyone in a pool and saying, right, we've got 4 of you that all do the same job, but we only need 3 going forward? How do you select the one person that is going to be made redundant? Getting the right 4 people in that pool in the first place is really important, something that doesn't often happen. And then making sure that you've got a very strong procedure about how you come to the conclusion that the person who does get made redundant is the right person for redundancy. I would say anecdotally that that's probably the area where you see most claims arising out of a redundancy situation. And again, very sector specific, but this idea that we're in a pandemic, there's a great business uncertainty, we're heading for a recession, therefore people will accept the fact that I'm going to make some redundancies, may have been around in March, but I would say generally now it's not as accepted by employees, and they are holding employers to task about making sure that they get the procedure right and that they understand how things are going. So it's not difficult to do, but it just needs to be planned properly. That's probably my top tip around sort of any reduction in the numbers around redundancy, is do a bit of groundwork, get your foundations sorted, take a bit of advice at the start, and actually you'll get through it really quickly. Because if you've got a genuine redundancy reason, most people will accept that actually this is something that has to happen because it's a non-fault termination. It's because the business no longer needs you, as opposed to something that the employee has done. And then just a quick sort of look at, that all sounds too hard, too difficult. We just want to move really quickly. We don't want to have to go through a procedure. We don't want to unsettle the other 3 people in that pool of 4 that actually are doing really well, that we know the person we want to get rid of. We perhaps might not be in a strict redundancy situation. Maybe that we just generally need to make some cost savings, or to rejig the team, or you've got one person who's just not adapting to the new life of working in the business post sort of March and the pandemic. So you might just say, well, actually that's great, but we just know who we want to get rid of, or we want to do it in a very quick, rip off the plaster, avoid the sort of uncertainty and having to go through a lot of procedures. And that's really where protected conversations and settlement agreements come in. You need to be a little bit careful, I would say, as a business, if you're known for just always going for the easy option and throwing money at a problem, because then employees get to a point where they expect that to happen. And I've got one on my desk at the moment where exactly that has happened. Everyone else has always got a package, but they've decided that they don't want to give this person a package, and he's absolutely just dragging his feet all the way along in respect to this and saying, no, I'm absolutely, you've cheated everyone else in this way, I want the same, I've been here for 15 years, I don't want to just go on statutory redundancy pay. And for whatever reason, the business has decided that they don't want to give him a settlement agreement. So we're at a bit of an impasse. So, protected conversation, settlement agreements, this is all off the record. And it's basically saying, look, we can either go down the path of a performance sort of disciplinary, or a conduct disciplinary, or a redundancy process. But ultimately, this is an alternative to it. So rather than go through that process, which we will do if you want us to, here's a package that we're offering you with a slight incentive to accept the deal that's on the table. And there you go. If they accept it, you do a settlement agreement. That's a legally binding document that ultimately means that they cannot bring any claims against the business arising out of their employment or the termination of their employment. As lawyers, we deal with them every day. It is a nice, neat way of dealing with it. It'll cost you slightly more to do it in that way, because obviously there'll be legal fees and you have to incentivize the employee to do it, but certainly it will save you time, it will save you energy, and it will ultimately, hopefully, avoid potential disputes and unsettling the rest of the workforce. So it's something to consider, not right for all circumstances, but it is an alternative to doing that. And there may be actually that, I've got one that I was talking to this morning, the narrative that they want to give to the market is that they're doing really well, but actually they need to do some restructuring. So they don't want to go through a redundancy program because it gives mixed messaging. So actually what we're going to do there is we're just going to have some protected conversations, off the record discussions, and settle out the 3 people that we've identified as no longer being required in the business. They could go through the redundancy process, but commercially they've made a decision that that's not the right way that they want to proceed with that. So again, this is sort of linking into changing terms, if you like. We don't need less people, we just need to reduce the cost. Times have changed, they need to be grateful for the work that they've got. How can we reduce our overhead cost? What changes can we make? Well, if you can get them to agree, then look at what you're spending money on and see about how that needs to change. Benefits is a really interesting one, because that, what people want out of remuneration has changed in 6 months. Beyond, lots of clients reporting people handing back company cars and saying actually they no longer want them because it's not worth the tax, that they're not there. Can you change the benefits? Can you remove benefits to reduce the cost? offering part-time working. If that works for you, sometimes that can work for employees, offering that flexibility. And as we say, decreasing pay and decreasing hours as well are other ways. So, you know, there are other ways of reducing overhead spend and an alternative to redundancy. But in my experience, I would say these are more temporary issues. I think if there's a permanent change to the business, then it's either going to be settlement agreement, protected conversation, or redundancy, ultimately in respect of how we go on that. And that's it. That's a very quick run through of those two areas, conscious of time, but hopefully that's given people a bit of an idea of the sort of issues that we're seeing at the moment, and ultimately, you know, some of the problems and how to avoid those problems to make sure you're not spending too much money with me and Nikki from a legal perspective.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Simon, Nikki. We've got a few good questions. We have taken a little bit longer than planned, but we've got most attendees still with us. So I think it's definitely topic of interest. So home working policy, is there a template? Or is that something they can speak to you guys about?
Yeah, I'd probably say that, I mean, there's general things which I think I touched on about what you generally see in them, but a lot of it might be very much on a case-by-case basis in terms of what businesses, what arrangements they have in place. But there's certainly pointers in terms of the specific things you'd want to see, which I mentioned about kind of equipment, about data security and IT, about management and supervision. But it's something, as I said, call the helpline, and we're happy to talk to them about it and give them some more information.
And it's probably the sort of cheapest way of dealing with that, because it's so personal to each business, is to have a go at doing it yourself first. Pull together some of the things that are prevalent or issues within your business, pull together something and then have a conversation with us, because then that'll make it quicker, easier, and just cheaper to get that all pulled together, because it is so personal to each business. You've got to be a bit careful sometimes of just pulling things off the internet, and it's great, you know, who doesn't Google and see what you can find there? And that's a great starter for 10. But because you need it to work for your business, so don't end up with something that starts sort of the tail wagging the dog, as it were. So you end up having to run your business in line with the policy you've put in. And honestly, so many clients come to us because, you know, they've not followed what's in their own policy. And when you say, well, why not? It's like, well, we've never done it like that. It's like, well, why have you got it in your policy? It's like, well, it's just been there. It was just standard wording. So they are very personal. So pull it together, get all the ideas together, and then give us a call, because then we'll be able to give you a lot more added value in respect of what we can do then.
We've had a question about insurance from Sue. So does company insurance cover employees having an accident at home, for example? And what's the liability?
Very much depends on your insurance policy. Most, and I say most with a big caveat of, you know, it's anecdotal, it's talking to insurance brokers that we deal with, would cover it in a pandemic situation, i.e. if it's a temporary workplace, then it would. If you are making a permanent move, then you would probably need to revisit the terms of your insurance, because my understanding is that would be a material change. I don't expect it would have massive difference. They would just ask you different questions on the policy from a policy perspective, but it should cover you in temporary circumstances around the pandemic. But if you're making permanent changes, then speak to your insurance broker, because each policy is different at the end of the day.
I've just popped our last poll up, which is just about topics of interest going forward, just while we're chatting through the questions. Yeah, we're going to provide the slides, and also there'll be a tape of this webinar on YouTube, which we'll email everybody about. And we've also got a quick reference guide, haven't we, Simon, that we're going to send out to everybody? Yeah. Okay. What measures do you employ what measures can someone employ to ensure staff are actually working from home? Timesheets, monitoring, or do you just have to trust them?
A mixture of all of those things, I think, actually, wouldn't you say, Simon? I think
yeah.
A lot of it you would say, if they're you've got to trust them. Obviously, if they're your employees, there's got to be some kind of trust between you. we found that people have kind of more regular check-ins with managers in terms of kind of finding what people are up to, and kind of more kind of maybe even changing like appraisal systems in terms of obviously how you're kind of managing what people are doing, and sort of like regular check-ins in terms of objectives and if they're being met and what output has been provided.
Yeah. It's probably demonstrative of a wider issue, isn't it? If you can't trust somebody to work unsupervised, but you know, it does happen, doesn't it?
And I think it's also depending on your workforce too. I mean, again, using the recruitment as an example, lots of recruiters have really said, look, because it's very much sales orientated and it's very much a team orientated sort of role, then we need people to be in the office and we need people to be working in the office. And there are certain sort of recruitment businesses working in certain areas that have been very keen to get people in, because they just feel that is a better way of making sure that everyone's productive. And then the other thing as well, that from other clients, and I suspect that the level will change and it'll be dependent from business to business, but one is a housing association where their sort of statistics have shown that people up to about £35,000 a year, anyone under £35,000 a year, actually they're finding productivity has really suffered. Over 35,000, then they've not found too much of an issue. So it's interesting that they've found a very much a sort of a marker in the amount of earnings, and those people that are earning either side of that, they've seen a big difference in productivity and what they need to do to try and manage and increase productivity to make sure everyone's delivering what they need to do.
Great, thank you. So we've got some feedback on the poll. I'll just end that and share it. So business protection and redundancy and restructures are looking like the most interesting topics. Furlough problems, nobody's got one.
Yeah.
Over that now. Yeah.
Yeah, and well, I think that's going to start from that what we're finding, and as a word of warning, if anyone has claimed furlough, is that the letters have now started to come out. So the period of being able to sort of report yourself to HMRC if you knew that there might have been a problem in your furlough grant claims was yesterday. I think it was the day before. I can't remember what day we're on now, but it was this week at some point. And what we've started to see now from clients are the letters have started to come out from HMRC to basically say, we think there might be an issue. They're very woolly letters. They don't tell you what they think the issue might be, but a letter basically saying, is there something you want to tell us? Because we think there might be a problem with your furlough claim. And they have started to come out with 2 or 3 calls this week from people that have had those letters. So if you do get one of those letters, then again, legal helplines there, give us a call and we can sort of talk you through and walk you through what you need to do to make sure you don't fall in any holes in respect of that. But long may it continue that furlough problems aren't an issue for everyone.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's probably a natural place to wrap up. Thank you ever so much, Nikki and Simon. I think that was a really useful session. Lots of useful tips on how to avoid the pitfalls. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. Please look at YouTube for a copy of the video if you need to refer back, and we will email you the slides and a quick reference guide later. If you're interested in attending any more of our webinars in the future, we have got one on the 17th of November, which is about goal setting in uncertain times. And that's with a couple of executive coaches, Sue G and Dave Verberg. So I think that will be a really good one. You can visit our website to sign up for that. And in December, we'll have a tax masterclass ahead of Brexit. So hopefully they will be of interest to you. Always open to feedback, guys. So look forward to hearing from you, and thank you very much.